welcome to Thumb Wind's End of the Road in Michigan podcast. Each week, we select one of our amazing stories about the Great Lakes region and the tip of Michigan's thumb. These are taken from thumbwind.com and presented here so that you can listen to it anytime, anywhere. Today's tale is about a once thriving lumber town that was entirely owned by a single company. This type of company town was common in 1800s Michigan, but many quickly vanished as the lumbering days faded away. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's tale from the end of the road. A lost lumber and company town, New River, Michigan, the story of a vanished town in Michigan's thumb. Near the tip of the eastern side of Michigan's thumb, lays a small cluster of neatly appointed cottages and mobile homes. Some have a commanding view of Lake Huron. This neighborhood is situated near a creek called New River. There is a street with a neat name, Tip o' Thumb Drive. It describes the neighborhood perfectly. It's almost idyllic. The question is, did someone develop this as a neighborhood during the cottage boom after World War II? Surprisingly, this cottage retirement community is way older than that. An 1870 plat map shows New River with a grid of plotted streets on both sides of the river, and a large dock extending out into Lake Huron. By 1900, all references to this community were gone, erased, expunged from the public record. This little neighborhood was once the thriving company town. However, the former town has been erased by time, nature, and a bit of redevelopment. The incorporation of New River, Michigan. The town of New River was located about a mile from Huron City and 8 miles from Port Austin. The area was formed from initial land grants dated May 12, 1845, to J. Spikerman and Walter Hume. Originally starting as a fishing village, the hamlet developed quickly. It was said that in the creek at New River, fish were so plentiful that it was a common practice for early settlers to catch them in the spring in huge nets. Often a year's worth of fish could be put away in barrels and cured. Sturgeon was common and frequently caught. In the early 1900s, there are stories of local residents and farmers finding stone arrowheads and clay and stone pipes around New River Creek. The local lore at the time alluded to the belief that it was once an Indian village or a hunting and gathering site for one of the many tribes that crisscrossed the region prior to European settlements. Lumber was the primary export of New River in the late 1800s. The town experienced rapid growth. A sawmill was built in 1853 using the water power of New River Creek. In addition to providing a power source, the creek carried the mill's sawdust out into the lake. It's worth noting that this contrasts with operations at Port Crescent, which used sawdust and lumbering waste as a source of fuel. A grist mill came in 1856. By 1858, industrialist Evan Clark employed up to 100 men and built docks for shipment of lumber. Other men who came there in the 1850s were J.R. Chambers in 1851, John Ginn in 1853, Francis Palms in 1854, S. Sharpstein 1855, Thomas Donahue in 1856, and Alexander Miller in 1858. Here Cooper, Creevy, and George used to operate an extensive salt block. However, their headquarters were in Port Austin. It's interesting to note that the first official deed recorded in Huron County, Michigan was from Lawrence M. Mason to the county of Huron. It is for a sum of $175 and describes what is now known as the New River Cemetery, consisting of 4 acres. The deed describes as being the burying ground now in use for Huron Township. By 1870, more lumbermen arrived. Cooper, Creevy, and Noble came and operated mills, established 2 salt wells. One was 1,040 feet deep, and the other was 1,003 feet deep. These wells produced an average of 150 barrels of salt a day. The salt was shipped to Detroit, Toledo, and St. Louis. Even today it's said that near the mouth of the New River Creek, there are still the foundation pilings driven in the ground where the salt blocks were located. New River was a company town. The company owned almost the whole village, which was common during the lumber era. They owned the cooper shop and made their own barrels for transporting salt, the houses in which the workers lived, their own lumber mills, and blacksmith shop. The company built and maintained a boarding house. This town had a long dock where steamers regularly stopped for freight and passengers. There is one sad chapter in the short history of New River. On October 23, 1871, there was a boiler explosion at the grist mill and salt block owned by W. H. Cooper. It was 1:30 in the afternoon when the mill was just starting its operations. Suddenly, the boiler head blew up, severely scalding 5 men and an 11-year-old boy who was in the fire room at the time. 3 of the men and the boy died of their burns. Per Mr. James Kilpatrick, a state geologist who visited in 1937, New River had the finest grade of salt found in Michigan. However, the salt block was discontinued in 1886 due to the economic downturn of the late 1800s. The low price of salt and the increasing costs of fuel doomed the operation. It should be noted fuel used was likely coal, and it was getting too expensive in the 1890s as a source of fuel. Also, cheap slashing and sawdust were no longer available as lumbering operations waned. By 1865, all sawmill operations at New River had ceased. One of the final acts of New River took place in 1895 at the Michigan Supreme Court. The case of Noble v. Thompson involved the debts and mortgage and taxes of the salt block at New River. Local lore from 1883 noted that this town had a long dock where steamers regularly stopped for freight and passengers. The small town had a store, a church, and a schoolhouse. When the salt industry declined, the town began to fade away. Finally, every vestige of what had been a flourishing town disappeared. Today, all that remains of the former Michigan lumber town of New River is the cemetery and the foundations of the salt block, which are buried near today's cottages overlooking Lake Huron. Sources for this story came from the Pioneer History of Huron County, Michigan by Florence McKinnon Gwynn, and from the History of Grindstone City area. This concludes this week's story. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Thumb Wynn's End of the Road podcast. If you like this kind of story, you are invited to subscribe to our podcast. Just search for The End of the Road in Michigan from wherever you're listening from. Please watch for and download next week's story and take a moment to give us a review. Have a great day.